This is our main passage. This has this idea of I am yours written all over it. And what's interesting about this passage is it doesn't seem like that right at the start, but that's the way it ends. Here's our passage this morning from the book of Matthew. Jesus went on from there and entered their synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. They asked him, and these are the religious leaders, they asked Jesus, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" So that they might accuse him. He said to them, "Which one of you who has a sheep, if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not take hold of it and lift it out? Of how much more value is a man than a sheep? So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." Then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And the man stretched it out, and it was restored, healthy like the other. But the Pharisees went out and conspired against Jesus how to destroy him. Jesus, aware of this, withdrew from there, and many followed him, and he healed them all, and ordered them not to make him known. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah. "Behold, my servant, whom I've chosen, my beloved, with whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, and he will proclaim justice to the Gentiles. He will not quarrel or cry aloud, nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, a smoldering wick he will not quench, until he brings justice to victory. And in his name the Gentiles will hope." In a former life, I worked in radio. And there's not a whole lot of glamour in radio. A lot of it's all behind the scenes. It's all audio. And I always said, I like radio. I preferred radio because I've got the face for radio. It's you don't have to be in front of a camera. These days, radio is almost all automated. In fact, the stuff you hear mostly on the radio these days, those voices are coming from some other city. It sounds like they're coming from Brownsville. It sounds like they're coming from McAllen, but these voices they might as well be Indianapolis or Miami or whatever. It's all recorded. It's all automated. But no matter what changes in radio, and we knew this to be true even as the internet started taking over, you always need the engineer. There's always the guy that still has to put all the computer stuff together, has to get all the audio signals together, and then still has to make sure that signal is getting out of the tower and into our cars and into our radios. There's still that guy who's got to coordinate all of this, the engineer. And we had one at the radio network where I worked. And we traveled. We were doing a live. We actually did a live show in Seattle. So we had made the trip cross country. This is from the Dayton area, Dayton, Ohio, all the way to Seattle. And we show up. We're at a big church. They got a big conference. They wanted us to do this thing live, and so we did. We took our morning show on the road. So we show up. And we get there. We get all the equipment set up. And one of the lines that they were supposed to have for us, things are kind of weird. Things are different. We're like, okay, this line isn't working. As they called it ISDN back then, which was a technology. How are we going to be able to broadcast to our listeners back in Ohio if this line isn't working? Finally, our engineer back in Ohio gets to get him on the phone, and he spends some hours. He gets it all put together. And we do. We have a great time. Finally, everything's working. We get to the end of that conference, and everything's done. We're tearing everything down, and we thank our hosts for getting us the line, the ISDN line, so that we could broadcast this event. And the comment was made by the technicians there, we don't have an ISDN line. And we're just like, well, what just happened? Now, since then, some have said, that's divine intervention. Somehow we're able to make it all work, and this church doesn't even have this, and it was a mega church. This place doesn't have what we're supposed to have. It still happened. But I also happen to know how good of an engineer we had back at the thing, and he used to chuckle. We would ask him, what happened here? And he would just kind of smile and he kind of chuckle. I think our engineer knew more about what was going on than any of us or the technicians in that church. I asked him one time about all of this, about the fact that he spends thankless hours making sure everything's working so that everything goes on the air. And his comment was, you know what, a job well done for me is when I hear you guys on the air and there are no hiccups. The sound is crystal. That the equipment is working. And again, he just kind of chuckles. That's what I get out of this. This is when he talked about being pleased. That's this idea of delight that we're working with this morning. Last week we talked about woohoo, the kind of delight that is kind of, jump for joy, it's giddy. A lot of emotion. But there's another word for delight in our Bibles that is more of the I am pleased kind of delight. Something where you take satisfaction in a job well done. Kind of like our engineer at the radio station. He was delighted in what was happening. He was delighted in the end result. Even though our engineer, he was not a guy, and if engineers, I'm sure you have some at your own workplaces, they're not the giddy type, right? They're the analysts, they're the analytics. They express their delight, they express their pleasure a little differently. And for our guy, John, it was a smile, a chuckle. We're talking about delight. We began a Bible study a few weeks back on the word delight in the Bible. And we're being given help from this book. In fact, if you don't have one, pick one up as you leave. The Delight book by Justin Rosso with Discipleship. We're talking about what it means to walk with Jesus using these words of delight. So you saw all of those different words for delight. Today, we're looking at this thoughtful delight. And this word shows up in our passage that we just read. It's in one of the unlikeliest of spots. If I was going to talk about delight, and I'm Matthew writing this, I probably wouldn't stick it where he does. At the end of this story about the man with the withered hand. It's in one of those moments in Jesus' life where there's just a lot of stuff going on. Some of it's chaotic, but a lot of it is filled with tension, absolute tension, conflict. I mean, Jesus shows up, and there are people that aren't all that happy with what Jesus is doing. And in that passage that we read, this man with the withered hand, Jesus does the spectacular. He heals somebody, but the grand scope of things, the things that we know that Jesus did, he's not raising somebody from the dead. He's not walking on water. It's still spectacular, but this word delight shows up at the end of it. When we get to our passage, there's all sorts of questions about who Jesus is. I mean, this is an ongoing thing in the New Testament especially. Ongoing thing. Who is Jesus? And Matthew's writing to, again, a congregation much like ours. And Matthew is helping them understand this is who Jesus is. But there were questions during Jesus' ministry about who he is. There are all sorts of questions. And much of the conflict is with those who control Israel's religion, the religious leaders. They control it so much that if you were participating in Israel's religion, and a lot of people did that in those days, the only way to get to God, and this is the way it was, the only way to get to God is to go through these guys. These religious leaders. They controlled everything. They controlled the temple. They controlled the synagogues. Between the Pharisees, the Sadducees, all these people we're reading about, they controlled religion. Okay, this is worth stopping right here, man. This is worth stopping right here. Absolutely. Oh, my word. Oh. Yes, a delight. Absolute. Thank you, Nellie. An absolute delight. This is awesome. Oh, my word. She's a cutie. 6 pounds, 3 ounces. Little Ashley, people. Little Ashley. Oh, my word. Well, glad you guys are here. I feel like a grand entrance, by the way. So we get to our passage, and the contention is between Jesus and these religious leaders. And the Jews had a rule. And we get to our passage that is about this rule. The rule is no work on the Sabbath. No work on Sabbath. Now, this is one of the oldest rules they had. I mean, we're talking about God's top 10, all the way back to the 10 Commandments. God gave this rule. But along the way, this rule had taken on a life of its own. And you get to the time of Jesus, pretty soon, no work on Saturday, again, their Sabbath, no work meant no walking more than a quarter of a mile. If you take one step beyond that quarter of a mile, you're working, and now you're in violation of the Sabbath. Yeah, I mean, yeah, there were a whole lot of rules like this. In fact, some have suggested that they had it down to a science where they were so nitpicky about this rule and about the sandals that they were wearing that they had their sandals all over town so that they would walk to a certain place in sandals less than a quarter mile, however long that distance was, get out of the sandals, put the new sandals on, and then walk another quarter mile because that would be okay. It all had to do with the sandals you were wearing now. That's like their own odometer. But they piled on all, and this is just a sample. They piled on all these rules. And again, remember, you want to be good with God? You want to have God smile at you? You have to go through these guys. They had all sorts of rules like this. Well, along comes Jesus. These religious leaders, they see Jesus' best friends picking grain. They're snacking in between meals, which I told is a healthy thing to do, depending on your snack, right? They're snacking on the grain as they walk through the fields. Well, picking the grain, actually taking the husk off grain, that was work on the Sabbath. And the religious leaders called the disciples on it. They called Jesus on it. And Jesus has a conversation with them, and he says, look, you got the Sabbath all wrong. He says, you got the Sabbath all wrong. You got me all wrong. You got the disciples all wrong. And he says, in fact, I'm the one that started this all. I'm Lord of the Sabbath. So he's giving them a theology lesson. And that's what brings us to our passage today. This conversation about what we're supposed to be doing on this Sabbath day, this day of rest that God has given Israel, this carries over. So one of the things that Israel did on these Saturdays was, much like we do on Sunday, they got together for their worship service. And so Jesus goes to the synagogue, he goes to their worship center, and they follow him. And of course, this is also probably their worship center. You know, he's now on their turf. And they get in there, and there's this guy with a withered hand. There's a guy with a withered hand. And it says, it seems to indicate that the Pharisees are sitting here thinking, let's test Jesus. Let's do this. And they ask Jesus, is it lawful? Is it legal by God's standards, in terms of work, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? We read that. Is it lawful to heal? Now, stop and think about what they're asking. That's awesome. That is just awesome. I love this. Good old Ashley's here. Think about the question, though. Is it lawful to heal? You know what that assumes? They're asking Jesus, is it lawful to heal? They're asking the only guy in the universe that knows how to heal. They're assuming that that Jesus can do this. Right? Is it lawful to heal? That blows my mind. They're trying to test this guy. They're trying to test Jesus. They're asking him, is it lawful to heal? That means that they assume, they know that Jesus can heal. There's only one person in all of the universe that can heal like that. And they're asking him, is it lawful to heal? And Jesus, of course, we saw the result. He's like, look, and again, he goes back to the Old Testament. This is in the Old Testament. If you got a sheep, the sheep falls into a ditch, the sheep falls into a hole, then, you don't waste any time getting the sheep out. It's okay. You're doing work there. And he says, people are more important than sheep. He's giving them a lesson from the Old Testament that they should know. He's pointing out the obvious. That this is okay. And, of course, the end result is they're totally mad. He beats them at their own game. Jesus is pointing out that people are. He's here for people. He's focused on people. That there are, what's interesting is this idea, there are sheep in the hole. And Jesus came to pull the sheep out. The sheep are called people. His focus is on people. So it's okay. It's okay to work on the Sabbath when it involves pulling sheep out of the hole. And of course, their reaction then is they begin plotting to kill Jesus. And what's interesting is this is happening in Matthew chapter 12. If we were to follow the story, in a few months, a year or so, they're going to get their wish. It happens. But this is where they start plotting. All over this guy with a withered hand. And who can do what on the Sabbath? Well, Jesus is not fazed. The rest of the passage tells us that Jesus, rest of the day, he continues to heal on the Sabbath. It says that everybody kept coming to him. And he kept healing and teaching. And that's where this delight comes in. Again, it's strange. It feels strange that Matthew, in the midst of all of this, would drop into the story something that he and the other disciples have been thinking about. As he sees this unfold with the man with the withered hand, he starts thinking, this is Isaiah. This is Isaiah 42. We're seeing Jesus fulfill the words of Isaiah. And this is what, again, Matthew says hundreds of years after Isaiah. Here is my servant, whom I have chosen, my beloved, in whom I delight. This is my servant, whom I have chosen, my beloved, in whom I delight. In the wake of the conversation with these religious leaders, in the wake of this man that's been healed, the withered hand, even in the wake of them plotting to kill Jesus, which the text tells us Jesus knew what they were up to. He knows what's going on. So there's all this tension, there's all this controversy, and Matthew's talking about delight. He's talking about the beloved in whom the Father delights. You see, Jesus focuses on people. And what Matthew sees is what the rest of the Bible is telling us, that as Jesus focuses on people, as Jesus rescues sheep from the hole and rescues sheep from the pit, as Jesus does this, he is causing delight with his Father. This brings the Father delight. This is why Jesus was sent. This is why Jesus came. In Matthew, he stops it all. In the midst of all the hubbub and the death threats and the controversy, he says, this is bringing the Father delight. And in the middle of the death threats, he then says this, that Jesus, again quoting Isaiah, he will proclaim justice to the nations. He will not argue or shout. No one will hear his voice in the streets. He will not break a bruised reed. He will not put out a smoldering wick. The nations will put their hope in his name. He's listing 6 things. These are 6 things. We're not going to unpack all 6 today. But it's all flowing out of this delight idea. All these things bring delight to the Father. The fact that Jesus is proclaiming justice to the nations, and that word justice, by the way, is talking about what Jesus is doing for our sins. And what he's doing for our sins in light of God's justice. He will not argue or shout. No one's going to hear his voice in the streets. He's not going to break a bruised reed, put out a smoldering wick. Nations will hope. All of that brings the Father delight, an absolute delight. And one of the reasons why Matthew starts thinking about that word delight is because he has seen this before. Early on in his letter to the congregation, Matthew describes an event early on in Jesus' life, at the very beginning of his ministry, Matthew chapter 3. He's talking about Jesus' baptism. And Jesus, at this baptism, is going to hear that same word. And this word delight that is being used here in Matthew 12, the same word that's being used in Matthew 3, is this idea of wow, of being pleased, of standing back and looking at the whole thing and being very, very satisfied in what the Son is doing. That kind of delight. You see this man with the withered hand? This man with the withered hand is a summary of all this. He's one who's not getting justice. He's one who is a bruised reed. He's one who is a smoldering wick. He's representative of all of this. And what Jesus is doing for that man with the withered hand, the restoration of his health, is what he's come to do for the nations. And it says the end result then is nations then putting their hope. You see, all of this, Jesus is there to break the chains. And that brings delight to the Father, absolute delight. Breaking chains, freeing people from all those rules, freeing people from all the things that ail them. Jesus is bringing healing, salvation, forgiveness to people who have no hope. And they didn't have any hope. There was no hope. Time and again, we're told in the New Testament, throughout Jesus' ministry, that these religious leaders have such a grip on the religion that it's causing oppression and depression among the people. Jesus is here to free everybody. He's here to break those chains. That's why they're all, as all of this is going down, they're all in the back room figuring out how we get rid of Jesus. Because Jesus is here to free everybody from them. And when the Father looks at all of this, he's saying, wow. So, wow, this is why I sent the Son. This is the Son in whom I'm delighted. And the end result, we saw at the end, the nations will put their hope in his name. So the Father delights in the Son, and the nations put their hope in Jesus. And there's almost like this cause and effect. As the Father delights in the Son, because the Son is focused on people, the people now have hope in Jesus. The Father delights the nations' hope. And again, Matthew has seen this before. He saw this when Jesus was baptized. When Jesus was baptized, there was a glory cloud. There was a cloud that came over the entire scene there at the Jordan River. And out of this cloud then comes this booming voice. And this booming voice says, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased." That same word, delighted. So Matthew's repeating in chapter 12, in the wake of the man with the withered hand, what he's already heard from heaven when Jesus was baptized in the Jordan River. God the Father sees the Son being baptized on behalf of sinners. That's what the text says. And when he sees all of this, he says, "This brings me delight." Wow. What a son. What a son. And God is saying this from that cloud to anybody who will listen. Listen to this guy. This is my son. I delight in my son. But it doesn't stop there. One of the reasons why Matthew is telling us about Jesus' baptism and the man with the withered hand, but especially at this baptism, is that it doesn't stop simply with Jesus. Jesus goes into the baptism waters on behalf of sinful people. Matthew's audience, me, you. That wow that the Father has for Jesus becomes our wow as well. The great missionary Paul says that when we were baptized, in our baptism, we were baptized into Christ's death. That means that in our baptism, Christ's death becomes ours. The penalty for sin is paid for. Salvation is given. Life is given. Being baptized into his death. So as Jesus is being baptized that day in the Jordan, what's true for Jesus becomes true for us in our baptism. You know that in our baptism then, God declares for anybody who is going to listen, that anyone who wants to hear, "This is my beloved Son. This is my beloved daughter, in whom I have delight." That's his declaration in our baptism. Justin calls it the verdict of delight. The verdict of delight. Every single one of us who've been baptized, the Father declares, "This is my beloved child in whom I delight." He is saying, "Oh, wow. Oh, wow." When we embrace Jesus in faith, God looks at us through Jesus and he says, "That's my child. Wow. That's awesome." That's awesome. Every single time. So no matter what is happening, and this is where this all comes down, no matter what is happening in your world, no matter what is happening in my world, no matter what's going on, whether it's a job or relationships or whatever's going on in your world, God has already declared for all time, "This is my child. This is my son. This is my daughter. I am absolutely delighted in this child." We always have the Father's delight. He's always giving us his wow. Last week we talked about we have his woo-hoo. But we also have his wow. We've all been there. We've all been there. We all have experienced this a little bit. And we see this on they've kind of romanticized this a bit. In the Hallmark Christmas movies, it seems like every Hallmark Christmas movie I've seen in the last 10 to 15 years always has the Christmas program scene, right? And little Luke and little Noel, they're headed to the Christmas program, right? And so they get up there, and my, doesn't she look like the cutest little angel? Doesn't he look like the cutest little sheep around the manger? She looks great as a Christmas tree, even though that costume is 5 sizes too big. Right? But we all do it. And again, you're thinking about how it normally goes down. This is true for me. You're sitting in the audience, and what are you doing as you're sitting there during the program? That's my Luke. That's my Noel. Right? And what's going on inside? I'm going, wow! It's delight, right? It's Jesus. That's the Father. For you and for me every single day. That's my son! That's my daughter! Wow! Absolute delight. And it's very easy for us. We start looking at all the stuff that just goes on in our lives. The mess. I was there this week. It wasn't a great week. You just have to stop and remind yourself that God delights in you. He delights in me. And nothing going down in the moment is ever going to change that. Ever. Wow. Are you kidding me? That's grace. That's His forgiveness. That's His mercy for me. I don't deserve that. I deserve His worst. Yet every single day we wake up, and when we wake up, the Father is saying, that's my child. That's my son. That's my daughter. I delight in them. Take notice of this. What do you think the man with the withered hand was thinking that morning when he woke up and went to the worship center? And again, those days, you have a adversity like that, you are on the low end of the economic scale. I mean, your life is not grand at all. And he goes there, and there's the religious leaders, and he's been trying to please them. He's been trying to make sure he's got all his I's dotted, his T's crossed, and it's a bear. And because he's got this withered hand, he's an outcast. He's one of those unclean people. More than likely, it's kind of surprising he's even in that synagogue. And there's Jesus. There's Jesus. The one in whom the Father delights. The one in whom bruised reeds and smoldering wicks show up, and he promises, I will never put it out. I will never break the reed. I'm going to give him healing. I'm going to give him grace. And his days changed. His life has changed. That's who Jesus is for us. Every single day. That's his wow for us. Just like it was for that guy that day. Let's pray.